Hey, there we are. Hi, Malcolm.
Am I there?
Yes.
You can see me now.
Yes, I can.
We're there.
Excellent.
Leave you to it then.
Okay. All right, Chris. How's it?
Hi.
What's it like in New York in the summer?
Muggy.
Muggy.
Muggy, yeah. Hot and humid.
So. New. But it's been reasonable weather here, but not as unpleasant, I think, as it can be in New York anyway.
Yeah.
So it's typical British weather. One day it's great, and the next day pretty awful.
Yep.
There we go. We talked about a lot of things before, and sort of one particular, more focused area is sort of talk about this whole issue of treatment, effects in treatment, and how perhaps our different experiences are, how our different countries deal with that.
Yes.
Because my experience here is that I regard it's wholly unsatisfactory. And I suppose what brings it to the fore again now is you would have read and heard that the government here has recently announced a wide-ranging inquiry, in fact 2 inquiries, because on the back of connected with a celebrity who's recently been found guilty of a number of assaults, and sort of separately to that, because it coming to a head at the same time, the suggestions that a government department some years ago had details of celebrity abusers, but arguably that was some way suppressed, and part of the inquiry is about that. And in fact, one of the inquiries being launched goes so far as to effectively even the political system and the political parties are within the ambit of that inquiry, and the attempt is to clearly get to the root as to why in the past this has been covered up. There are a number of reasons being suggested for that, and of course part of it is to learn and ensure that the behaviours of before are not repeated. And an awful lot has been written in the last couple of days about this, and there's obviously a great deal of support to get behind what appears to have been the misuse of power up until relatively quite recently for these things. But coming back to the point in question, what sort of disappoints me when I can sort of guess how much time and effort and money will be expended on undertaking this inquiry, which isn't thought to, conclude within a year. In fact, we've got a general election here next year, and it's thought that, I think quite properly, that the inquiry to produce a proper report will take a lot longer, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's 2 years. Well, that's a lot of money being spent, and it's well spent money, but you don't see on the other side, when there's the whole thing about the victims here, and it's said that even more people are now coming forward because they feel more confident to do so. But you don't see, because it's got to come from the government, you don't hear the government say, look, in response to what we're now learning, we're also going to throw X amount of money at supporting those victims who have previously come forward, who are now about to come forward. And that just continues to frustrate me, that we are now having an open debate upon these issues, the misuse of power, and that's what it's really all about, to ensure that doesn't happen again. I mean, there's some suggestion that celebrities should be subject to more stricter regimes of checking, etc. But we're not seeing that, not seeing as many column inches devoted to the treatment and recovery, because here, when an individual comes forward, and let's assume that the first person that they speak to, the first professional they approach is a police officer. They will be probably assigned a victim support officer, but their role is to support them in relation to the criminal proceedings. It's not to support them in relation to the trauma that they are now feeling as a consequence of disclosing, or what they felt before, the future effects either. So there's no mandatory requirement here that once someone comes forward, that the individual to whom the complaint is made, say, that rings an alarm bell in me, and I know I've now got to direct you somewhere else. And even if an individual were to go to a medical practitioner here, they may or should receive a direction towards some therapies and supports and counselling, whatever that may take. But there's no, it's difficult to sort of say there's an absolute mandatory requirement about it, because of course in some circumstances the reporting may not be adequately informed at the time of initial reporting for certainly a medical practitioner to take a view where to direct someone. But it's unsatisfactory that the victims, can be, whether it's an adult of any age or it's a child, that there isn't that path that they are immediately taken towards, and they're put on that path, and it's one that continues and continues and now supported all the way, because it just doesn't happen. So, before I go on and talk about then, should they be lucky enough to get into the system? I mean, tell me in the States, what's the experience there, sort of historically and now, as to whether people will be directed to those kind of services?
Well, sadly, I think there are some parallels, certainly, but I think by and large the experience for male victims within the United States is, if anything, less likely to lead to being connected to psychological or even medical care. More often than not, what I hear about are people who, when they first try to come forward, and let's say, for instance, they do disclose or they do come forward and they try to report to a law enforcement professional. Well, one of the things that we know is, especially in the case of male victims of sexual abuse, there's a disclosure delay. For child victims, it's upwards of 20 years on average. So when a male victim finally does come forward, oftentimes it's decades after the fact. And they may go to a police station, or they may try to meet with an attorney to ask to see if there's anything that they can do, and they find very quickly that oftentimes they're running up against statutes of limitations in various jurisdictions here within the United States, that there is no possibility for a criminal complaint to be lodged, and they'll basically get turned away. And when they get turned away, there's no real interaction between behavioral health services and the law enforcement community in a systemic, organized manner. Some cities, some jurisdictions are better than others, obviously, but by and large, I don't think there is a well-organized, planned out response plan that I could say makes it more likely that any victim who comes forward, or any man who would come forward, can at least have some degree of assurance that they'll get connected to mental health resources or healing resources.
It's interesting you say. I mean, I find it, because I appreciate the statute. When you mention the statute of limitations that they experience, interesting, I made a note of that, because that's being talked about here. That because of, you suddenly get a case where the prosecution against an individual fails, and again, it's probably involving a celebrity because of the media knowledge around it. You then get an immediate call from those people saying, or those campaigners sitting on that side of the fence saying, there should be a statute of limitations here. Right. And if someone brings forward a complaint, for example, 20 or 30 years, well, how can you possibly determine whether they're true or false? And there should be that limit for the criminal proceedings. Now, thankfully, we don't have that here.
Right.
So as soon as once someone comes forward, whatever mature age they may be, whether 20, 30 years, and certainly in this recent conviction against a celebrity related to offences that took place, I think, between 1986 and 1968.
Yep.
So the question of nearly 50 years having gone by was kind of neither here nor there. It was an allegation, there was good evidence behind it, and he was convicted on the back of that evidence. So the good side here is that if someone walks in to a police station here, then they will be listened to, and certainly listened to sympathetically, and then it's a question of whether there is sufficient evidence to take it forward, but they certainly won't be turned away. The disappointment from my side is that they're then not, having been listened to so attentively by very skilled and highly trained police officers here, at the end of the interview, they aren't then directed to another agency that can help them to for the fact that when they get home, they're going to, be fairly emotional and will continue to be that way throughout the criminal process, and particularly if they've got to give evidence at a trial. And of course, as we know, the effects of this don't end just when there happens to be a conviction. Again, we've heard that last week with victims saying there is some comfort and relief that there's been a conviction because they've been exonerated in terms of their complaints. But of course, we both know that doesn't end suddenly. They don't wake up the following morning and say, my life is now fantastic, because it's not. So there is that still disconnect. But if someone in the US was to, irrespective of going to a law enforcement agency officer, if they were to go to a medical practitioner, what's the, again, I assume it's, there's no mandatory requirement for individuals to, once they find out someone's been abused, to go and tell someone else. But if once an individual does come to the attention of perhaps some medical professional, is there again a pathway for individuals to be set on to be supported?
Well, again, I think it's going to be very, very dependent upon what jurisdiction a person comes forward and makes those disclosures in, what the laws in that state or that community are, in terms of, first, there's two sort of separate issues that you raised. One is the question of mandatory reporting, and one is the question of, are there policies or procedures in place to help connect somebody who does disclose with behavioral health support. To take the first piece, mandatory reporting, one of the things that has come out more and more often in the U.S. are more strict mandatory reporting laws, where medical professionals, law enforcement, teachers, people who have any connection to child welfare, for instance, in many, many instances are required by law to report to legal authorities any allegations of child abuse. And there's no question of whether or not these are credible allegations. People are not expected to make that determination. If they have a suspicion, they are required by law in many jurisdictions to make those reports. That said, one of the things we also know is the compliance rate with that is nowhere near as high as it should be. There's studies that show, for instance, teachers are very, very are much less likely to report colleagues of when they hear allegations of sexual abuse of children than they will potentially if a child comes in and reports a parent. So there's a lot of challenges around mandatory reporting issues. The second piece, in terms of connecting somebody who comes forward, going back to mandatory reporting for a second though, those are all also connected with child abuse cases. When we talk about adults coming forward, mandatory reporting laws really don't kick in. It's a totally different ballgame. So if somebody's coming forward and talking about an abuse allegation that happened decades in the past, there's no, to the best of my knowledge, there are very few, if any, legal strictures in place that compel professionals, whether they're medical or law enforcement, to make official reports to state or government authorities. The second piece of what we were just talking about in terms of, again, trying to find ways to connect survivors with behavioral health, mental health, social resources. It's a much, I think in many ways, it's much different, again, here in the U.S. as it is in the U.K., where we don't have a centralized healthcare system or a centralized healthcare bureaucracy. So a lot of that overlap really doesn't exist. It's really on the shoulders of an individual to go out and proactively find the resources that they think they need in order to, do the work of healing. And I think that's one of the obstacles we face. Personally, I think there's a huge difference between the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of healing. I think that they are separate endeavors that can and very oftentimes should be intricately linked with one another. But to pursue criminal charges against an abuser is a piece of a much larger puzzle for any individual survivor. And sadly, one of the things that we know, and I would imagine this is very likely the same in the UK, it's very difficult to successfully prosecute sexual crimes. The evidentiary burden can be very difficult to overcome. Oftentimes, even though there may be, when we're dealing with institutions like schools or government organizations, or for instance in the Catholic Church or other churches, there's oftentimes mounds and mounds and mounds of institutional evidence of allegations against individuals that you may be able to find, but it's much more difficult to get physical evidence, especially if the abuse is something that was alleged to have happened many, many years ago. So you're very right to point out that encouraging and finding ways to make it to get survivors access to the criminal justice system is an important thing, and we do want to see that happen more and more often. We do really need to stress that there's a balance that needs to happen, and we need to recognize that just, even if we are able to successfully prosecute, an abuser, that doesn't mean that the work for the victim is over. There's a long, long process of healing that oftentimes can take decades, if not, an entire lifetime. And I think that's also one of the reasons why it's so important that this current inquiry that's just been announced in the UK is so vitally important. I'm sure there are some people who will say, well, some of these allegations go back to the 70s, if not earlier. What does it matter today? If, these government officials are no longer in office, or some of them are dead even. The fact of the matter is, many of their victims are still alive today, and giving those victims the sense that their charges have been heard, that their stories are corroborated, that yes, what happened to them really happened, and that it is taken seriously, can be a hugely important piece to their being able to make progress in their own healing and their recovery. And, I think it's important for us to really help people understand that the legacy of being a victim of sexual abuse is something that many victims carry for their entire lives.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the experience here from just the case I've dealt with and others you read about is that having been listened to and finally it being acknowledged that you were a victim is very powerful, and there is it doesn't sweep away, but it does provide an awful lot of I think it's just that acknowledgement from the outside world that this did really happen, because the experience is that when these complaints were made when they were children, they weren't just listened to, and they weren't even listened to possibly by their parents. I mean, a number of cases you just find absolutely remarkable. Yeah. I mean, hopefully that has now changed, but yes, there's no doubt that an inquiry where we get to the bottom of it and there's acknowledgement that the rich and powerful did assault and abuse children, I think will provide a significant comfort to those that felt they just weren't listened to at the time. I mean,
and would also.
Sorry.
I'd also add, Malcolm, not just that, yes, these things did happen, but to also hear the society say it was wrong that this was done to you, and it was wrong that you were abused, and it was wrong that we as a society swept this under the rug. There's no way that you can give a survivor back, an undamaged, or a life, without the abuse having occurred. One of the things we say is, you can't undo the trauma.
No.
However, acknowledging that it did occur is a very important piece, and also just beginning that conversation of saying, yes, we acknowledge that this happened, and we say that this was wrong. It should not have happened, and we're going to do what we can to ensure that moving forward, you as a victim are believed to be reported, and we as a society are going to do better to ensure that there are not future children or future victims. That begins to, I think, create a better response, one that supports the healing and hopefully promotes a kind of social change that is really ultimately what we really want to be pushing towards.
Yeah, that issue about society is important because, again, there's a sense that those who don't understand this say, well, why is it important? And why don't these people come forward when it happens? And they're immediately questioning and doubtful as to the accuracy and honesty of these complainants. So there is an education required in society about the effects of abuse and why people are just not able, or if they were able, they say something they weren't listened to, but once they then enter adulthood, they find that they're just not able to, and for society to understand why that is the case. Because if we can achieve that, then there is, I think, even greater hope and a momentum then that those, the politicians with the money will say, we will now, reflect society's feelings about this, and because they now have a better understanding, that we will support the victims with better treatment and improve their prospects of recovery, because we know the effects are long term. But there is that perhaps understandable ignorance of society at large, because they just seem to be naturally suspicious that the only reason these people are saying these things is because they want compensation, which is, we talked about before, is well down the back of the queue of their list of priorities, even if it's on there, because often it's not at all. It just doesn't even enter their head. They just want to be sit down with someone and talk to someone, and someone opposite them say, yes, I entirely accept what you say, and we will now find out what happened and sort it out for you. So society needs to be educated. There's no doubt about that. But the more of these cases that come forward, the better it is, because we've already seen a couple of charities here have already announced in the last week or so that more and more individuals are coming forward. We knew that as a result of, we've heard the Jimmy Savile inquiry, and the abuse that again went on over decades. That, I was talking to a local police officer who was telling me that her experience was that they were now seeing many more people come forward of a certain age that clearly wrapped this up inside them for decades, but now felt, because others were talking about what happened to them because of Jimmy Savile, they could do that too. And again, we're now seeing it as a consequence of someone else. So there is, we are making progress. It is, on the one side, very troubling and worrying, and when you read and hear more and more about the level of abuse that went on, the fact is it has gone on. It's no doubt gone on for centuries, and the rich and powerful and have taken advantage of those of a lower standing in society. And we can't change the past, but we can certainly change the future. And I think part of that may come here if we're able to introduce mandatory reporting. We don't have it, and there's a recent discussion or a debate in Parliament recently where one member of Parliament was observing that nothing had changed since the 50s, when this was, a lot of this was going on when we're looking back at, for example, the Catholic Church. So one thing that hasn't changed is there's still no requirement for people to report. So there is now momentum building up on that, and our Home Secretary said earlier on the week that she was not now ruling that out in response to a specific question. So that may come about, I think, and one of the perhaps additional benefits here, as opposed to in the States, where we've got a joined up medical network, the National Health Service, despite all its faults, that at least there are connections across the entire country, and once someone enters that, then they can be followed through and supported all the way. So there is greater hope from me that actually if we can introduce a system of mandatory reporting alongside that, there is a channel by which individuals are directed towards support and treatment. And once they enter that, despite the risk that they may fall out of it because there's a lack of resources in the NHS, but at least they are in a nationwide system that will be committed, at least on paper, to doing certain things that they don't, then they're going to be in difficulties. But there is some, say, prospect if we can introduce mandatory reporting, even perhaps without it, that we'll be able to treat people and treat them properly and get them back on track. But our current system is that even now when people do enter the system, there is a lack of resource. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, it's interesting to hear what it is like in the States, but here, mental health services, I think I may have said before, just do not rank that high. Again, being cynical on the political agenda, it's just not a sexy topic. If you're reducing the deaths from cancer or cardiac arrest, it's got an immediate resonance with your populace, and they buy into that and respond. But mental health has always had a bit of a, it's not treated in the same way as in the US, where you've been much more comfortable about psychological issues. It's still something individuals of a certain generation here are just very sceptical about it and dismissive. But that is changing. The younger generation are much more accept that as part of life. It's part of treatment. Just as if you broke your leg, you go and see an orthopedic surgeon. Now I think they're much more relaxed about going and seek psychiatric and consultant psychologists. I find that in the work that I do.
Well, I think I agree, and I think we are starting to see similar patterns here in the States in terms of younger, sort of the millennials and younger people understanding more of the connections between medical conditions, medical health, behavioral health, and mental health. I think one of the things that's really helped us see those connections a lot better is the dramatic rise. Almost ironically, one of the things that's happened in response to the military conflicts that we've been fighting alongside our friends in England for much of the past decade and a half. Oh, God, it seems like it just stretches out forever, doesn't it? But with the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and one of the things that we have seen is a huge increase in reporting of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's a very difficult challenge for the military healthcare system and even the civilian healthcare systems to sort of catch up with what we actually are really finally understanding about the linkage and the connection between experiences of trauma and how they impact us both physically and emotionally. And I think bringing that understanding together is one of the things that's going to help us to bridge this gap between, whereas you can see a lot of people going out and wearing pink ribbons for breast cancer awareness or talking about heart disease or diabetes, it's still very difficult to get people to rally around a cause like sexual abuse awareness. Or mental health challenges. And one of the things we're finally starting to see in research, like things here in the United States, is a landmark study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is very, very important. And I'm not sure if there's a similar one in the UK. But what we're finally starting to understand clearly is the direct linkage between experiences of abuse and significant trauma, especially when they're experienced in childhood, in those critical developmental stages, and sort of consequent behavioral issues, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, in addition to lots of other medical conditions, substance abuse, diabetes, heart disease. There's linkage between experiences of trauma and abuse and all of these other health issues that we're grappling with as a society. So I think one of the things that we're finally starting to understand is, maybe the old paradigm was, if you break your arm, you break your arm. You get you go get a cast put on it, and you heal, and that's fine. And I think a lot of people maybe thought, well, the brain surely must be the same way. If we um, try to, the brain should heal itself in the way that the body heals itself. But I think we're finally starting to understand that the brain doesn't heal in quite the same way. And doing the work of healing on an emotional level requires a different kind of support. You can't just put a Band-Aid on abuse. And I think we lost each other.